The Syrian civil war has led to 6.7 million people fleeing the country. And there are large Syrian refugee populations currently living in Turkey and Lebanon and Jordan. The vast majority of Syrian refugees are in the region. European countries, though, have also taken on many Syrian refugees, chief among them Germany. Unsurprisingly, significant groups of these displaced people have greeted Assad's fall with joy. In Istanbul, hundreds of Syrians gathered on the weekend to celebrate the end of the Assad dynasty. And there were also gatherings in Beirut, Berlin, Madrid, Paris, London, and Manchester. Earlier today, I spoke to a Syrian living in Britain, Amar Azouz, to find out how he was viewing Assad's fall. Amar Azouz moved to the UK in 2011 to study and is now a research fellow at the University of Oxford. In 2023, he published the book Domicide, Architecture, War, and the Destruction of Home in Syria. I started by asking Amar how he responded to the weekend's news from his home country.
It was in a weekend. At that time, Saturday evening, we heard the news that Homs is going to fall on that evening, and then things kept moving forward, and suddenly we heard that it's all coming into Damascus, and then in the night I couldn't sleep, so I just stayed awake until 6 a.m. on that day, and we heard that the regime has fallen. So I feel there was a volcano of emotions. I was remembering everything that happened in the last 13 years, and the memory has been just flashing from the forced displacement to the killing of the people to the torture. And there were tears of joy, and there were tears of sadness and sorrow of everything we have went through.
And can you talk about the past 13 years for you, I suppose? I know you left Syria in 2011. You haven't been able to return since. I suppose the civil war lasted a lot longer than anyone was sort of initially expecting it to. What has that period been like for you?
So I came to the UK in November 2011. It was 6 months into the start of the revolution. In Homs, already protests were sweeping across the city. People were already being killed by the regime or imprisoned. And for me, the purpose of my movement was primarily education. So I came from my studies here to do my master's and my PhD. And every year I would think that the war would end and next year would be the year that I would return to my country. But I never returned since 2011. And looking back in time, I feel exile has been a damaging and destructive experience, because for people who are far away from their homeland, the memory always comes back to them. One would yearn for the city that they left behind and for the people that we left, like family members, relatives, friends, all this infrastructure of support that you no longer have when you arrive to a host country. And you have to not only start from scratch, but I would imagine even from below scratch to build a new life in a new place. So despite the fact that I speak about exile as a painful experience, as an experience of forced displacement, but also exile has a pleasure as well. There are pleasures of exile, and this includes meeting people from all around the world and being introduced to a new culture, but also trying to find a second home. So it was a mixed experience, from yearning to a homeland, but also at the same time trying to build a new life in exile.
It's very clear from the way sort of you're speaking and your facial expression that you're relieved and sort of joyous that Assad has gone, has fled, is no longer leader of Syria. Is that mainly because of what's happened over the past 13 years, or sort of before the civil war started, were you already someone who was very much sort of opposed to Assad?
I mean, we lived in a place where fear was everywhere. People are afraid from each other because there was a sense of that people would report each other if they speak about politics. And therefore, if people are engaged politically, they will be imprisoned or tortured or forcibly disappeared. And we lived in almost like a kingdom of fear, that this kingdom felt very brutal and violent and oppressive for decades. And therefore, nobody dared to speak or to express their mind. We didn't have political parties that they can engage with the local communities and tell us what are our opinions about politics. So it was a long time before the war started that this violence was manifesting itself in many different forms, from silencing political opponents to even arresting young people such as Talal al-Malouhi, who was imprisoned before the war for writing, for being a blogger at the time.
You've written a book, Domicide, Architecture, War and the Destruction of Home in Syria. Can you sort of explain the idea there and sort of why you decided to focus on that topic?
So in any war we are witnessing around the world, from Palestine to Ukraine, from Sudan to Syria, and before the many other countries and cities, we often hear about collateral damage, and therefore we see buildings being destroyed, neighborhoods being erased to the ground. But what we are trying to make as scholars in this research field is to say that architecture is not on the side of the um, battlefield, but it's at the heart of the battlefield. And therefore, what we have seen in the last 13 years in Syria, that villages, cities, the built environment has been deliberately destroyed, not because it was part of the collateral damage, but because of the intention to collectively punish people. So, in that sense, architecture becomes weaponized as a way to destroy a sense of community, a sense of identity and belonging, to displace people, to make it impossible for them to live in that area. But even when people would return, they return to the ruins of their homelands. So, in my book, Domicide, I try to unpack what it means to lose one's home, and what are the consequences for people who see their home being destroyed, but also what does home mean for people when they are displaced. So even when millions of refugees are displaced, and in Syria there are more than 6.5 million Syrians scattered around the world, destruction from afar also causes a huge sense of grief and misery that one sees their own homeland being destroyed from far away.
And are you worried about what comes next? I mean, I suppose we have sort of a number of examples now where a sort of reprehensible, oppressive dictator falls, and things don't necessarily get much better. So I suppose Iraq or Libya being fairly obvious examples. Do you fear what could happen next in Syria?
I think at this very moment, there is a huge sense of hope that this kingdom of fear has collapsed. And there's joy and celebration that people can return to their country after years, and some people even who were forcibly displaced before the war started because of their political opinions. Now there's this sense of hope and joy that the question of return, the idea of return, is possible. We are also, like, around the world, we are seeing that prisoners are freed now after living for years and years um, at the time of horrors inside these prisons. And therefore, at this moment, it's a moment of joy that these people are reunited with their families and friends and loved ones. The question of tomorrow is, of course, very difficult and painful. Everyone wants to have stability and peace in the country. At the moment, there are many uncertainties on what the future would look like. And there are, of course, fears and anxieties about the future. But for today, it's just a moment for us to breathe and remember what happened, try to celebrate the release, the freedom of the innocent lives that have been imprisoned for years. And the question of tomorrow would come soon, to think about what next look like and how can we transfer into a democratic space. And that would need, it seems like a long road to go, but we're just starting it.
And on that question of return, I mean, it's become a sort of talking point in British media and the Western media, I think, I suppose in part because refugees have become a bit political football. So I think Germany have already sort of stopped processing Syrian claims because they say, well, Assad is gone, so it's not necessarily a dangerous place. Now, to me, Syria still looks like a fairly dangerous place because it's so uncertain. At the same time, it does seem like some people are already going back to Syria. What's sort of your take on this? I mean, to me, if I was a Syrian refugee, I'd feel fairly scared to go back now because it's such an unstable situation. But sort of where do you stand on this?
I think the question of return is very important. And as I said, more than half of the population has been displaced. So not only outside the country, in neighboring countries such as Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, and beyond, but also the internally displaced people. There are more than 6.5 million Syrians who are displaced inside the country. And reports have shown us that some people have been displaced internally more than 25 times, because every time the conflict front lines shift or their circumstances change. So many people have left, but their cities and towns and homes have not left them. So the question of return is essential today. And of course, this would be dependent on the day after, and how does tomorrow look like. If there is a democratic and a genuine political transformation that ensures that people's lives would be protected and their rights would be protected, then the return, we would see many people returning. But even now, in the last week or so, we have seen people going back to their homes if they are displaced inside the country, such as to Idlib. So they have started returning to Aleppo after years of forced displacement. But also we have seen people returning from Lebanon and from Turkey. So I think we have to understand that the ache and the pain of displacement is enormous, and many people would return for many different reasons, to live there or maybe to visit. But I think as long as it's as long as it is a return by their own will, that would be like the welcome idea of return, but not against people's will.